Good afternoon. I'm Shannon DeRejo from Creamer Media. Welcome to our webinar on local manufacturing, where our panel of speakers will unpack the inputs, support, and incentives that are required to grow a competitive manufacturing sector in South Africa. Our webinar today is sponsored by Discovery Green, SYSPRO, the Steel and Engineering Industries Federation of Southern Africa, or SEIFSA, Columbus Stainless, and KEW Foundries. We thank them for their support in making this event possible. Before we start, please note that we've activated the Q&A function for your questions. Please direct any questions to the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. While we may not get to every question during the discussion, we will review each one. Additionally, the chat feature is enabled for your comments and insights. You can look for it right next to the Q&A. Remember, though, questions should go into the Q&A to ensure they are properly addressed in that section. Please be informed that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available to you afterwards. We're also broadcasting live on YouTube, and the link will be shared in the chat once it becomes accessible. Today's webinar will be facilitated by Philippa Rodseth, Executive Director at the Manufacturing Circle. Philippa's work journey currently centers on the Manufacturing Circle, where she has helped develop and grow this industry association for 10 years. Philippa will facilitate the discussion with our panel, which consists of Tafadzwa Chibanguza, Chief Operations Officer at SEIFSA, Johan Head of Strategic Sales for EMEA and APAC at SYSPRO, Nepgen, Head of Discovery Green, and Beth Dealtry, Head of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at the National Association of Automotive Components and Allied Manufacturers, or NAACAM. I'll hand over now to Philippa, who will start the proceedings.
Thank you, Shannon. The Manufacturing Circle holds the development and growth of the local manufacturing sector as hugely important, and also underpinned by the importance of competitiveness. So I'm very much looking forward to facilitating this panel today, given that I think the timing is also specifically opportune. We have, I would suggest, in our global environment, the only thing that is certain is uncertainty, and that is something that we all have to address and be mindful of in this rapidly changing environment. And so with that, I'm very keen to get into the discussion, to hear from our panelists who come from a range of backgrounds, to see what it is that from a local manufacturing perspective we can unpack and address in this very fluid environment in which we find ourselves. So with that, Tafadzwa, I'd like to start with you. I often think of the steels and engineering sector as really, I'd like to describe it as the backbone of the manufacturing sector, in that metals and engineering go into so many parts of so many value chains. And on that basis, I'd like to maybe start off with you to understand from a SEIFSA perspective what you would suggest are at the moment the most pressing challenges that are currently faced in South Africa's steel and engineering sector.
Thank you, Philippa. Afternoon to you and to the fellow panelists and the participants on the call. I think that's a very apt description, Philippa, and in fact, we refer to it as that as well, that the steel and engineering sector, or metals and engineering, you correctly said, which also incorporates the non-ferrous side, is the backbone of manufacturing, and I think even the industrial base of the country. It constitutes 26% of manufacturing and 3.2% of GDP on a direct basis. But its influence, it touches to energy, it touches to logistics, it touches to water, right across, right down to even consumer products, right? So it gives you a sense of how far steel and metals generally go. I think if I had to list the main issues that are currently facing the sector, the first is that the external environment is as important as the domestic. So if you look at it in terms of total exports relative to total sales, that number is about 50%. So 50% of sales are local, 50% are domestic. But with that said, when you look at the trade intensity, the imports and exports relative to the sector's GDP, you are actually closer to the order of 80%, right? So it's a highly trade exposed sector. Now, why I'm saying that is you very also correctly said in your intro that the only certainty in the global environment right now is uncertainty. What is going on from east to west complicates the entire environment. And you have to look at the IMF's latest report that is downgrading the global macroeconomic outlook. So the first point would be the big challenge is the global macro is highly constrained. And we see that trickling down, particularly to a trade exposed sector. When we then look domestically, I would list two. They are somewhat related, but I think the most important is this sector's performance. If you look at it in the context of economic indicators, it's a coinciding indicator in that it responds to current immediate, economic movements, economic growth, and or gross fixed capital formation. And we've seen fixed capital formation domestically being considerably constrained. And if you take it particularly public sector fixed capital formation, and also confidence has affected the private side. So you have constrained fixed capital formation, which if you remember, the subsectors that I mentioned supplying into the different areas are affected then across the board in terms of low fixed capital formation in all those areas. The last one I would add, Philippa, and this is not an exhaustive list, but just I think what we would highlight as some of the top three is in such an environment, what we also see is as a growing risk is the municipal service delivery, which we are seeing that, and that has multiple implications just from day-to-day operations, but particularly hurting is the cost implications that it has when private companies have to step in to do what municipalities are doing. I mean, that's probably a conversation we have with members on a daily basis. And then, so that I don't take up too much of time on this one point, Philippa, I'll park it there and list those as potentially the top three. But as I said, obviously, given additional time, we could go on.
Thanks, Taffy, and well noted. I think we're not short of challenges, I guess, in the metals and engineering and manufacturing sector as well. But equally important is what is it that we are doing to address these issues? How do we navigate the space? And I think that was a very good summation of I guess the value chain within metals and engineering and how that fits into manufacturing and all of the issues that we need to navigate across the global dynamics as well as what's happening locally, because that really is, we have to have a holistic approach and solution. So that's very helpful in terms of setting the context. Beth, I'd like to move to you now, really looking at sort of the automotive components manufacturing sector, almost as a slightly deeper dive in some of these issues that we are looking to navigate from a local manufacturing point of view. And in your view, can you take us through what you would suggest are the biggest, let's say, challenges and opportunities? Let's look to both facing South Africa's automotive components manufacturing sector.
Sure, thanks, Philippa. I think, look, I mean, on the challenges side, to a large extent, the challenges that Tafadzwa outlined from a kind of metals and engineering perspective are very much echoed in the component manufacturing sector. I think, as we've all been saying so far, the uncertainty is certainly a challenge. But I think what we're seeing and flipping it onto the opportunity side is what we, particularly from an automotive perspective, what we're witnessing at the moment is a massive change in kind of global world order and how the value chain is structured globally. And yes, there's obviously a lot of risk and challenge associated with that, but equally there is some opportunity that should and could be captured in the kind of chaos of it all at the moment. I mean, we've been having quite a few interesting conversations post the US tariffs around, well, does this actually put us in potentially a better position because we're not as tariffed as China? Look, it's moving so rapidly, it's hard to kind of pinpoint, but it does open up opportunities for new trade relationships. It opens up opportunities for I think, tightening relationships with Africa and with the EU. And I think for me, at the moment, from an export perspective, that's probably, ironically, where both the biggest challenge sits, but equally the biggest opportunity is navigating that uncertainty and making the most of it and finding the silver linings where they exist. Domestically, realistically speaking, our biggest current domestic challenge is purely domestic demand. I think we've seen over the past decade, vehicle production numbers as well as vehicle sales numbers are pretty stagnant. And with the sales particularly, you're no longer seeing it just stagnant with total number and the kind of share of locally produced versus importers remaining constant. Instead, what we're seeing is stagnant numbers plus a rising import penetration. And what does it ultimately mean? It impacts production volumes. And if OEM production volumes are impacted, component production volumes are impacted. I think everyone on the call who's in the manufacturing sector recognizes the, I guess, importance of scale economies in the kind of underlying competitiveness of the sector. And as that reduces, or as production volumes reduce, we are certainly finding that that's impacting competitiveness in the sector. So for me, number one, probably challenge in the sector is domestic demand. I think everything Tafadzwa kind of outlined regarding municipal infrastructure, any element that I suppose ultimately impacts what a private company is having to pay for is impacting the price competitiveness of their product, and that ultimately hinders kind of Team South Africa's competitiveness in a global industry, which at the end of the day, particularly in the automotive sector, we are heavily export oriented. And so in that sense, price competitiveness along with quality is really championed there. So for me, that's where the challenge sits. But equally, at the same side, the domestic market does offer opportunity. I think everyone's familiar. The master plan sets out a target of 60% local content. We're sitting at about 40% in component manufacturing, but there's a significant range between OEMs. You find some OEMs that are closer to the 60 mark and some that are 40 and possibly even below. And that range in itself indicates that there's a capability that's inherently available in South Africa that is an opportunity that should be captured. Yes, I know the localization is never as easy as it may seem on paper, but that is an innate opportunity that needs to be realized and urgently so. And then I think my kind of final opportunity here is I know there's a lot of hype around the NEV transition in the automotive context and moving to electric vehicles, and whether or not that happens in the next 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, a transition will take place. And I think South Africa is well positioned from an access to raw materials and an access to manufacturing capabilities to take advantage of localizing some seriously high value components where maybe within an internal combustion engine environment, we haven't localized a lot of those kind of engine type of components. So that itself is also an opportunity, although maybe more of a longer term one.
Thanks, Beth. I think you touched on quite a few important points there. You know, the need to be agile as far as where we're sitting in this changing world order. I think a lot of us have alluded to this already on the call, and also demand, as you know, certainly across all of us manufacturers. That demand is so important because then it enables economies of scale and competitiveness. So hugely important. And you've also touched on a couple of the policy sort of related issues. And I think for me also what's quite interesting is, are there areas where we have specific expertise or could possibly, you know, follow sort of various niche aspects. So that's very helpful in setting the context from your world and your perspective. Thank you. Johan, I'd like to turn to you now. So we've heard from two manufacturing associations. So you've heard about this world of you know, from a manufacturer's perspective, the various issues, challenges that are being faced. And I think, you know, part of the reason for this webinar as well is whatever has or needs to happen, we've got to bear competitiveness in mind. So is there talk to us about that, because you know, on the one hand, negotiating supply side challenges across utilities, municipalities, tariffs, you know, etc., and exports, we need to remain competitive. So, can you share with us some of your thoughts from a SYSPRO perspective as to how digital technology is reshaping the manufacturing landscape in South Africa?
Sure. Thanks, Philippa. I think we're all essentially going to start at the same point, which is anybody in the manufacturing sector at the moment, every morning, if you pick up a newspaper, you switch on the radio, your morning starts with, what the heck is happening at this stage? And I think from a manufacturing point of view, the first highlight is actually, I can't think of any other occasion where the major topic in the world is almost manufacturing, and then very close second, sometimes in the same conversation, is technology. Okay, everything across all of the social media platforms, all news is around where will we manufacture, where should we manufacture, what is going on around these things. I think specifically with technology in the manufacturing sector, if I can pick on some of Taffy's members, we need to understand that manufacturing typically or traditionally has always been a little bit slow to adopt technology. Okay, I always say, especially in the heavy engineering sectors, it's always compared with, well, will I pay money on an intangible asset, or will I actually rather buy a new machine that can go onto the factory floor? And it's always very difficult to understand the contribution, like you said, to competitiveness of the technology factor into that case. Beth also mentioned quite a few times around the current uncertainty. You know, everybody, and we can already see that, you know, people are very nervous around making decisions. But the reality is that is probably the number one role of technology in these times. We all know, we've all agreed there's change coming. That is the certainty. We know there's change coming. And change for the manufacturing, can I say that is a fairly slow industry? Change is going to actually result in even your words, agility, requires fast decision making. And I think that is probably, there's a lot of fancy technology out in the market at the moment, and we get bombarded with a lot of things. But by far the biggest contribution in shaping this is the ability to make data supported decisions around all of these things. What should we actually be doing? And that is really the technology I think that the sector should focus on, is how can I actually make better decisions, and how will I remain, or to remain competitive, what is the decision that I should actually make? But it comes a little bit with a word of warning. As I said, there's a lot of technology out there. And I have a friend that's a very avid cyclist that always says, you know, we all want to train like champions, but we don't want to eat like champions. You know, unfortunately with technology, we have the same problem. We all want the flashy technology, but we do not want to actually understand the work and the effort in actually establishing that platform in a digital era, to actually have a digital platform from where to actually leverage decision making and deploying technology in all of these things. So that's sort of one big thing, and a little bit of a warning to actually say, guys, you need help in decision making. I think that's first and foremost. You're going to make a lot of, if anybody on this call is sitting there thinking and say, well, we're not going to make any decisions in the next couple of months that affects this business, then I think then you're up for a surprise. And it is how to actually drive that decision making based on data, based on pure thought, in the right fashion, I think is where technology is really going to come to the forefront.
Thanks, Johan. And before I move on to Andre with my next question, could you give a little bit of a little more insight into enterprise resource planning? ERP, and as to how maybe that could look to helping manufacturers improve efficiency and competitiveness. Just maybe by way of an example, because I like your analogy on the cyclists and sports and eating, right? So could you maybe just talk us through maybe one sort of specific example or thought process?
100%. I think so. So ERP is obviously just the acronym that is by and large become very much a misnomer in terms of what the technology actually is. But let's just say it refers to the transactional platform that runs across the whole organization, all data points, that captures all of the data throughout the supply chain, the manufacturing part of it, the sales, the customer, and actually then providing access to that data for decision making and business perspective. So every single financial transaction, I always say you need to understand that everything from the factory floor, somebody issuing a piece of metal to a lathe on the factory floor and transcribing that movement of steel all the way through to the financial statement that gets presented at board level. That whole gap between what happens on the factory floor all the way to the financial results in the boardroom, that is what ERP actually provides you, or supposed to provide you, is translating that in real time, accurate, all of those kind of acronyms that we now use for, or words that we use for technology. But that's basically the base that we want to cover, is to make sure that that gap is filled in a digital format.
Now that makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Johan, for dumbing it down, certainly for me. Some people would call me a little bit technology averse, but it's important. And I think also, as you indicate, it's one can't manage what you don't measure, right? So I think some of those maxims hold true, irrespective of our crazy world out there that's changing all so often. Some of these principles, are very, very important, irrespective. Andre, I'd like to move to you now, and I want to zoom out a little bit. So we've heard about, metals and engineering. We've heard about automotive components. We've heard about, if I can use the acronym, ERP, and various technology aspects in remaining competitive. And so, we in manufacturing dealing with all of these on a daily basis, but it's also very important to look forward and ahead to the medium term, to the long term, and also the space we're navigating now. And so I'd like to hear from you from a Discovery Green perspective. What strategies are available to manufacturing businesses when considering alternative forms of energy? And from experience, is there anything in terms of highest adoption rates that you've seen, and what's associated with medium to long-term risks?
Thank you. Thanks, Philippa. I think maybe as a start, and it's important to note, I think everyone in the audience here is I think if you rewind 10 years ago, you'd probably say, maybe even longer, the biggest cost driver for manufacturing probably wasn't electricity, or the increases in electricity. And I think gradually over the last, decade and a half, it's becoming an increasing portion of the expenses paid by manufacturers in South Africa, and it's climbing and it's climbing. I think more recently, if you just look at sort of the national increases, we're talking, this year alone is a sort of CPI plus 8 on that, and over the last decade, it's exceeded that considerably. So naturally, a lot of businesses have been looking at ways in which to curb that cost, and a way to mitigate against it. It also had the additional benefit of it clean and renewable and reduce your actual emissions. So there are basically sort of two strategies that manufacturers have been looking at. One that all South Africans know very, very well is on-site solar plus battery. I think we all, especially during the last 2 years, have adopted that in our personal capacity. I think we've all, in our personal capacity, become, gotten PhDs in renewable energy just by nature of finding ways to generate electricity in South Africa. And that has been a big part of the manufacturing shift towards, putting solar panels on your rooftop, putting batteries in your facilities. There's also another form that has been rapidly developing, and it's very much a form that's been around globally for a very long time, and it's slowly building out, especially with the proliferation of the private market for renewable energy in South Africa, and that is called wheeling. Now, the way wheeling works, for those who are not familiar with it, is kind of what you're doing right now. When you're buying your electricity, you don't know exactly which power station it's coming from, but you are wheeling it across the transmission grid, the distribution grid, and getting it to your business. And what an option is now for the manufacturing sector is to say, listen, instead of putting panels on my rooftop, spending a bit of capex, putting things on site, could I not use the way I'm currently using electricity and leverage utility scale, massive wind and solar plants somewhere in South Africa and wheel that energy to my business, getting the benefits of renewable energy to my operations and the emissions reductions and the cost savings that come with it, without necessarily working on putting something on site. Often with this manufacturing, you have to make a trade-off. Do I invest in solar panels or in batteries, or do I put in more manufacturing equipment? And these are trade-offs that need to be made. When it comes to adoption rate, now that is an interesting one, and I don't think a lot of people know this, but South Africa, especially over the last years, I've seen probably one of the most massive adoption of rooftop or bedded solar generation in the world. I think there's been, currently Eskom is tracking roughly 6 gigawatts of solar generation capacity. If you look at the daily consumption for us as a country, you can actually see this dip in the day, and those are the solar panels coming through. Of course, when the sun doesn't shine in South Africa, it reverses, but be that as it may, it's been adopted well. And then on the wheeling side, it's actually been something that South Africa has been doing for a while, also around about 67 gigawatts of operational projects, representing around about 8% of the country's generation. But it's been sold to Eskom. But now it's been being opened up and sold to the private industry, and now being opened up as a mechanism for businesses to access that. When it comes to which is the most optimal for any business on that, I mean, it is very much a bespoke one. There's just maybe a few points to take into account. I think manufacturing, you can either have sort of a short-term view or you can have a long-term view on it. And we at Discovery View definitely, advocate for the long-term view. It's definitely, definitely the safest place to be. And when you're looking at manufacturing, if you're a manufacturer in South Africa, you've got to consider a couple of things when you consider your renewable energy strategy. That speaks to the risk. I think the first one is, how much renewable energy are you actually getting based on your solutions? So, is it 10, 20%? Is it 70%? Is it 80%? Is it 90%? And that's hugely important, because the higher renewable energy you get, the more you are protecting your business against above inflation increases in the cost of your electricity. That is massive. You're also protecting a big part of your business against a looming carbon tax, which is going to hit the manufacturing sector, it's going to hit electricity, in the future. And you've got to think about those costs. And you're also protecting your businesses against changes in the way electricity is being priced in South Africa. And recently, we've seen a very rapid changing electricity market as the market prepares for this whole unbundling. And the mechanics have really, really changed on that. And if you put all of those together, if you have a short-term view, it is how quickly can I get solutions on site. If you're looking at a long-term view, generally, how can I get as much renewable energy as possible? And that is where wheeling and those sort of solutions come through quite strongly.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. I think that gives a very interesting context and view as to agility, future opportunities, and sort of moving towards the renewable space. And I was actually interested to read in Creamer Media's engineering news on the 22nd the results of a survey that was commissioned across business executives from 15 different countries, including South Africa, that indicates that corporates now overwhelmingly view the transition from fossil fuels to renewable electricity as key to their future competitiveness, as well as a driver of investment decision making. So that really links quite nicely to your comments, and I think also the topic of this webinar. So with that, I'd like to go back to you, Tafadzwa. We've talked about we've got a bit of an understanding now, I think, or let's say outline of manufacturing, competitiveness, renewables. In the end, competitiveness and underpinning on manufacturing competitiveness in South Africa comes down to or depends quite a lot on skills and a skilled workforce. And I note that that's also one of the questions in that has been posted. So can you give us a bit of perspective from SEIFSA's point of view on South Africa's manufacturers needing a skilled workforce to remain competitive, and how SEIFSA is engaging with government and industry to promote skills development and workforce readiness in the sector?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Philippa. Yeah, I mean, the skills area can be our biggest constraint as to the criticism that has sometimes been leveled around the education system at a macro level in terms of what is holding back growth potential. But as you also say, it's a major enabler. And maybe the best way to tackle your question is to talk from our perspective as SEIFSA. And that's not to pitch it really as an advert, but maybe to highlight our socioeconomic contribution in that area, because as SEIFSA, for the last 4 decades, we own a technical training center, all private sector funded by the private sector, as I've mentioned. And what we do there is develop technical skills across 9 trades for the sector. Now, just to give a sense, and I mean, again, like I said, it's not so much about that training center, but talking to the need of industry for the skills. One of my colleagues recently did a interesting analysis where if you look at the average age of the current artisan who is working in industry is closer to at least 50 plus and nearing retirement. These are the skilled people who have many years packed under their belts. But what you have coming in is a much slower rate than that. So much so that you have in the order of about a speed bump coming of about 20 years, a gap between those coming out and those not being replaced quick enough. So naturally, then our training center does contribute considerably in that area. And I mean, just to give you a sense of the demand for those skills, Philippa, we are going through our reporting cycle now, and we looked at the numbers over 3 years. About 1,300 students have gone through, and not just starting, but going to ending and trade testing, as I mentioned, across all the important technical trades, boilermaker, welder, fitter and turner, etc. And 98% of those were absorbed into industry, just to give you a sense of the demand for those skills. What we've also then done, at least in pushing the dial quite a bit, is we have invested quite a lot in the future skills, because I think Johan very, very accurately captured it, that this is a sector that has been slow to adopt technology. And part of that, one might argue, is linked to the historic skill set that wasn't necessarily geared toward a technology-based manufacturing and more toward the hands-on and the rest. And in fact, where the curriculum is going now, of course, informed by industry, is we've done a lot of investment at technical skills level into into trades like mechatronics, into trades like coding that comes into that, because that's what the future worker of tomorrow will need. So in a way, it starts to address the very accurate point that was made by Johan. And then with that, in that skills environment, Philippa, the last thing I will say is we also see a considerable movement, in fact, in our sphere as well, where incubation is critical as well. So you are not only preparing someone for the work area to be a factory worker or person, you know, in a typical factory setting, but you want to create people who will be employers. And that's where we see the role of incubation, and that's some of the programs that we have. So I thought to respond to your question that way, Philippa, in terms of that being our socioeconomic contribution. But the country is targeting something like 30,000 artisans. I've mentioned to you that on a 3-year basis, we are looking at about 1,500. So that's a drop in the ocean. But I can't stress your opening point enough that that could be the biggest constraint for unlocking all the opportunities that we had spoken about across these different value areas and unlocking the potential. Thanks, Philippa.
Thanks, Taffy. That's very helpful in illustrating the work that's being done specifically to address, you know, the challenges that we face across the country, and really touching on, I think, you know, the current tangible requirements as far as welder, boiler making, but then also, you know, the future skills as well. And again, I think it talks about being agile and adept, because we really need both. And the point you also make about, you know, building that pipeline, because skills is one thing, expertise and experience is another. So I think that artisanal training and experience is absolutely critical, as you've pointed out. Beth, I want to turn to you again and get some insights from you as to how NAACAM, or the kind of work that NAACAM is doing to deepen value chains and boost local manufacturing content. That's, you know, if you could just give us some insights on that, I'd really like to hear from you. Thanks.
So you pose it as a very simple question, but I think it probably speaks to all of the work that NAACAM does. I mean, at the end of the day, our mandate is improving the operating environment for auto component manufacturers. And ultimately, what does an improved environment mean? It means greater volumes and more localization. And so almost all of our work, be it in the skills sector or division, which Taffy was talking about on their end, there's numerous kind of different elements that we try and touch on to push localization forward. And I think taking it back a step, I guess the first question is, well, what are the barriers to localization? What have we identified as really being the constraints? Beyond what we've already discussed about, I suppose, the general infrastructural environment, which obviously is a constraint that one needs to work around. Other key kind of areas that we've been focusing on are your testing infrastructure. It's all the small costs that add up. So at the moment, testing, if you are wanting to localize a component in South Africa, more times than not, you're exporting it to Germany or other countries for the testing to take place, to re-import it. If there was errors or problems in your testing, you have to redo that cycle, and that just ultimately adds to your part price. So we've been working at identifying testing facilities in South Africa and what tests they could potentially onshore. Reality is you can't do all auto tests. It's a far too broad a sector, but where we can bring in a few more testing capabilities, that would certainly support greater levels of localization. Skills that Taffy spoke to, I think, absolutely, it's a massive barrier to localization and progression in the sector. Ironically, I was speaking to a member a little while ago who was saying, as much as skills is a barrier, it's a barrier when one is looking at growing. At the moment, when you're in a relatively stagnant industry, it presents slightly less of a barrier, but nevertheless, there are shortages in the exact same areas that Taffy spoke to. And so once again, then I think one of the questions in the chat box was around public-private partnerships. And here, I think this is where the SEIFSA play an incredibly big and important role in terms of trying to promote, or at least establish, a kind of pipeline of individuals entering the sector to try and grow that that kind of pool of qualified individuals. So I know we work hand in hand with SEIFSA on quite a few projects there, being our manufacturing SETA, and I'm sure Tafi at SEIFSA does similar with their relevant SETA. Beyond that, on a competitiveness level, at the end of the day, if we are competitive, globally speaking, I don't want to say localization is guaranteed. There's a lot of global purchasing dynamics involved in our sector, but it certainly makes the business case a little bit easier. And again, this goes to another successful public-private partnership, which is ASCI, which is the Automotive Supply Chain Competitiveness Initiative. And this has got ourselves as NAACAM, the OEMs through NAMSA, NUMSA is the union, and DTIC is our kind of primary government body. And here, all of these entities have come together to implement shop floor upgrades, particularly with the technology kind of focus in component manufacturing firms to try and improve their what we call world-class manufacturing capabilities, ultimately looking to boost competitiveness, which in theory should lead to greater levels of localization. Beyond that, other kind of strategies, I think the reality is we have to think slightly outside of the box in what is a relatively constrained domestic environment. If I keep in my silo of just automotive component manufacturing, you're limiting scale, you're limiting opportunities. And so what we found is getting a degree of traction and at least moving things slightly forward is also looking at what we call allied sectors. So for example, we work with some entities within the kind of port rail, maritime, etc. kind of industries where we share a commonality in terms of manufacturing capability, and particularly for SMEs where maybe autos isn't giving sufficient volume to create A, a case for localization, and B, honestly, a case for business viability. Can we pull together other opportunities in allied sectors to create a basket that suddenly makes viable for all sectors? And I think it's those kind of different bespoke type of approaches to localization, which NAACAM is working on, but I think a lot of the sector and manufacturing sector parties, I know obviously Philippa, yourself in manufacturing circle too, all looking at in how we can drive deeper localization and bring in the value. Because I think at the end of the day, we're unequivocal. From a South Africa perspective, that's where your employment comes from. That's where your economic value addition comes from and where your growth will ultimately emanate from. So critically important, never an easy task, but I hope that's given at least a sense at a very high level of the various areas that we try to tackle.
Thanks, Beth. That definitely does. And when I asked my question, I deliberately didn't use the word localization in the question. And I think you answered incredibly well. For me, I sometimes feel that localization as a starting point is perceived, or possibly even, I would suggest, misperceived as being automatically uncompetitive, etc. So I think all of those examples that you gave talked to the importance of competitiveness, business case, and all of that. Then it can work hand in hand with an initiative or an outcome to localize or produce more locally, on the back of that basis.
Maybe if I can also just add, Philippa, I think there's also sometimes a misperception to your point there that South Africa is innately uncompetitive. And I think the reality is, if you walk many of my members' shop floors, you will see world-class facilities that truly could compete with the best of the best wherever you look in the world. For them, it's really about, and this goes to value addition and localization, it's about accessing scale, be it through the domestic market, the export market. And I think maybe I hope it didn't come across that way at all in my initial remarks, but I do think I want to amplify the fact that we can get bogged down in this, what do we need to do to improve things? And it's so difficult, but we do have really capable world-class companies in our country. And it's about getting them greater exposure, greater scale, rather than sitting here and thinking we're stuck with companies that would never make it in any other destination.
I completely concur, and I love nothing more than a site visit because to a competitive and well operating factory, we've got a lot of competence here. And also before I go to Johan, I just also wanted to say that I like your use of term of Team South Africa, or SA Inc. And I think that's absolutely something we need to do a lot more of in terms of identifying and and promoting, well, what I would suggest is sometimes pockets of excellence. Hopefully those can, we need to connect the dots and learn from each other. Johan, so can you talk to us a little bit, to the extent that you can? You've heard some of the issues, from a manufacturing perspective in terms of compliance with local and international requirements, in terms of possibly specifications or tariff requirements. To the extent that you can talk to it from your world and SYSPRO, are there sort of areas that ERP systems could assist with? Can you touch on that? How can we work smarter in this world? And you're on mute there, I think.
Couldn't find my mouse. Apologies for that. Yeah, I think the tariff side. So actually, before I answer your question, Philippa, if you'll give me a moment to just concur with Beth. I think throughout my career, even in my current role, I've had the opportunity to walk through quite a few automotive manufacturers, component manufacturers in South Africa, and from a competitive nature, I actually think the automotive industry is in a very privileged position because they have global benchmarking, they work in global firms and everything. And to be honest, anybody in that industry in South Africa is, I can almost say, state of the art. So definitely agree with that on that side. On the compliance side, I think we actually, as a technology platform, as an ERP platform, and some people might, I don't know if they can throw me off this call, but they might want to throw me off this call. From a technology perspective, we actually love compliance, okay, or compliance requirements. It is one of the interesting things that, computers or computer systems love rules and sticking to the rules. If you can give me a rule, the system will follow that rule, and he will make sure that that rule gets followed on every single basis, every single point, everywhere. I always engage with customers, and then customer says, well, when this happens, I would like an email sent. And I said, really, are you sure you want to generate? Because understand, we are exceptionally good at sending emails or sending emergency messages every single time that any exception that happens, any rule gets broken, then technology that too really comes to play. And compliance, I think, is one of those areas that we've always felt, and I'm not only talking about, I want to say, government regulatory compliance. I think South Africa is uniquely positioned that, let me tie into the automotive industry. I think if you've supplied to the big OEM manufacturers in automotive, you understand compliance. That might not be government regulated, but it is very much customer regulated. Probably at a more smaller scale for other manufacturers in South Africa. The best example I can use that everybody knows is Woolworths. Anybody that actually manufactures something for Woolworths understand that there might be regulatory compliance, but in actual fact, what drives your compliance in your factory is actually the Woolworths compliance. And quite often that is exactly where a system comes into being. I've got lovely case studies of we've got one or two actually in South Africa, companies that manufacture for the automotive industry, even some that manufacture for NASA. Coming back to Beth's earlier question, we should not be ashamed of what is currently happening in South Africa. There's companies outside Cape Town that manufactures satellite components for NASA, the best possible in the world. But compliance is extremely important in that space. The same is actually true for tariffs. Tariffs for us at a technology level is a lookup and a transaction. I think what is important on the tariff scale for all manufacturers, everybody on this call understands the fact that you cannot manufacture if you don't understand your cost. And that is really where a system becomes absolutely crucial. I think the one thing that the current limelight on global manufacturing has shown is You can't do this on a cigarette box anymore. That's always what we always said. Somebody would sort of do a calculation on a cigarette box and say, well, that's my cost. I add a margin onto that, and then I can actually sell. That definitely doesn't happen anymore. And with tariff, that's going to be very complicated. But the actual execution of tariffs is something that systems actually have been handling. Understand that tariffs is not new. Especially in South Africa, we've had import tariffs for years and years. So tariffs is not new, and the execution of tariffs is not something new. The important aspect of it is what is happening to my cost, and can I get clarity on my cost? That's actually the driving force I think, for all manufacturers in South Africa, especially now, especially if we want to bring it back home. If we're talking about being more competitive, then it implies that we understand our cost.
Good points there, Johan. And while we're talking about examples of excellence in South Africa, let's not forget our square kilometer array, radio telescope. Absolutely phenomenal. Yeah, and yeah, no more back of the envelopes or cigarette boxes, to your point, in terms of manufacturers and cost.
I don't think cigarette boxes allow you to write on them anymore. They've now become too slippery. You can't do that.
Andre, we've got a lot of manufacturers in the audience. So talk to us about, and manufacturers and businesses, give us some suggestions on how businesses can scale up supply of affordable energy beyond on-site systems. I think, as you rightly noted, we start a lot on site. I mean, we also use the example of what we're doing in our domestic environment. So talk to us about that, and just sort of, again, in terms of seeing the opportunities, the future, the agility, and you might also want to just talk a little bit on just the low carbon economy and opportunities for positioning there.
Sure. So maybe as a start, and this is almost ironic, is South Africa's got some of the best renewable energy resources in the world. And I think it makes sense if you look outside. It's winter and it's sunny and it's wonderful. And we've got such amazing natural resources in South Africa, yet South Africa has some of the lowest penetration of renewable energy in the world, which is actually quite scary. And if you think about what that means in terms of an opportunity, I think you look at it slightly at a different lens. For manufacturing specifically, given that we have this amazing resources, given that there's an opportunity for this, there's no reason why South African manufacturing cannot operate on some of the lowest costs electricity in the world. There's no reason why South African companies can't be some of the most renewable or green, lowest emission businesses in the world. The possibility or the capability is there in order to do it, and I think a lot of manufacturers have taken the action to do that. Now, how to get to that point is a bit of a journey on this, and a lot of companies and manufacturers have taken a number of steps to do this. Some of them for avoiding load shedding or avoiding cost increases, some of them to reduce their footprint because they're exporting their product internationally. And we're all realizing now that, apart from, I think, a few countries at this point in time, the majority do put a value on the renewable or the emissions of a particular product and the ability to compete internationally. I think in particular Europe, if you do export your product there, it becomes a valuable attribute. So the question really is how do manufacturers get more and more renewable energy? The simple answer is you have to look at strategies that take you from where you are right now to as close as 100% in one go. And the reason I say that is the problem with an approach of layering, and this is how I think a lot of business look at it, say, listen, a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, is that you are compounding risk on your basis. So, for example, we can't control the wind, we can't control the sun, and businesses aren't expected to control their consumption. Now, if you add all those things together, we're talking about a very volatile mix of variables on that. So from a generation point of view, when manufacturers look at how to do it, I think the solution is to go with someone who can deal with that volatility on your behalf so that you can focus on doing your business and giving you a reduction in your cost on this. Manufacturers operate mostly during the day, although there's a lot of them that operate 24/7, but the largest consumption is during the day, which lends itself quite nicely to a combination solution, putting up some embedded generation, and then for the rest, looking at wheeling solutions to provide a way to manage the rest of your consumption on that. And I think a lot of businesses are starting to look at that and approaching that, and that is how you get your amount of renewable energy up to hopefully the 90s. And that is possible. Businesses can do that.
Well, that's a good aspirational target. Thank you. I'm going to go for our last round of comments or questions, partly to address some of the questions in the Q&A. So participants, please feel free to continue to post those. One of the areas that's come out in some of the comments and questions, and Taffy, I'm going to come back to you, is the policy space. And you know, as Manufacturing Circle and SEIFSA, we've worked and engaged quite a lot together with others, industry, governments. You know, what is it that we can do? And I'm going to ask a very specific question to you to address demand. I mean, there are so many areas and you know, let's say challenges manufacturers have to face. And sometimes in prioritizing what to address, in some of our conversations, we've often suggested, you know, if we can get that demand side pull while in parallel dealing with the supply side challenges, it's a good base to work from. So can you talk to us a little bit on policy or regulatory reforms in your view? What could most effectively support the let's say the revival or to sustain, revive, grow our local manufacturing sector?
Yeah, thanks, Philippa, and you're right. I mean, that's a conversation we probably have almost daily. But I think I'll touch on one aspect which has many legs to it, right? So by touching on the one aspect, I cover many areas. And firstly, I mean, that demand has to be separated: public demand, private demand, right? Our general view is that we've had a very slow development of the public procurement regulations, which would deal with public demand. That's R1 trillion that was budgeted this time around. There you can lumber obligations around local, around preference for local companies, etc. You know, so there's that side. Our view is that on the private side, you can't dictate for private companies to buy local, right? And you can't rely on them or, again, place on them altruistic obligations to say you will buy local for reasons that are patriotic, right? So the point I'm making there is that you need to incentivize private demand in terms of how buying local. But to your point then, Philippa, this one area I was going to say that would talk to how to drive demand broadly. I want to maybe lean on a comment Beth said earlier on. We think working together between the public sector and the private sector in the deployment of projects through PPPs, public-private partnership, we think there's a big opportunity there. And just using the companies on the call right now, I mean, Andre, if you guys were to be plugged into developing these solutions across the board in terms of the grid, the wheeling, and of course with competition from others as well, SYSPRO, your systems right into municipal level, right? That would fix public procurement because we know that system is broken. And I think the comments earlier on about systems love rules, you know, so you already get that compliance in and weed out a lot of the bad. But the point then is this, Philippa, we think at least the state has proved that they can't do it alone. The fiscal purse is tied. we even need to consider VAT increases, just to remain afloat. So the idea is that if you were to distribute that public-private partnership, even in the development or in the fixing of Gauteng's water system, you bring in private sector engineers, you bring in private sector capital, while resolving the issue, you start to create that demand for valves, for pipes, I can go on the product list. I know a big area for you, Philippa, is transmission. If you were to break up the transmission grid in terms of its deployment into pieces where you have private capital, private engineers, steel companies, you concession projects, so that could work. And I could labor the examples. So the point is, I think the big reform that is more a mindset shift that is actually needed is this dropping this ideological idea that only a centralized place can do all this planning, but you distribute it by letting private sector and public sector work together. And then maybe lastly, Philippa, it would be the opportunity in this reform process, and I know it's currently in the PPP regulations that are coming into effect, I think it's June, even things like unsolicited bids, where you have a consortium that touches everything we had said, from the manufacturing right up to the finance, tabling an unsolicited bid to fix 2,000 kilometers of electricity transmission grid. You table that, it goes through the correct processes. That way you start getting demand. So really, you're fixing the country while at the same time increasing this demand pool that is absolutely critical, because it's in essence the tide that lifts all boats, that demand. So we think in that PPP regulations, there's a lot that can be done from driving demand. Yeah, thanks, Philippa.
Oh, thanks, Tafadzwa. And I think, I would like to suggest using the SA Inc. or Team SA narrative. We've certainly got a good group of willing and able across, across public and private sector, as well as our manufacturers who, and I think to Johan's point, a lot of manufacturers who are currently exporting, that means they are by default competitive, and those are companies and manufacturers that are managing despite many of the challenges. So it's a good base to build from. Beth, if I could ask you, so we've talked quite a lot about sort of the local manufacturing landscape from an automotive component perspective. There's been a question in the Q&A relating to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area agreements and possible opportunities in that regard. Would you like to just share some thoughts on that with us? And also, if you'd like to maybe just touch on, I don't know, the general kind of tariff space in terms of exports to the US, to the extent that you want to touch on that as well. I just want to sort of hear your view in terms of exports and where we're sitting in that space.
Perfect. I think what I'll do is I'll tackle the US question first, because it leads into the AFCFTA question. I think on the US tariffs, obviously automotive sector's been hit pretty hard, along with steel and aluminium, with us being under the Section 232 tariffs, which are done accordingly in the interest of national security. So this is separate to the original South Africa 30% reciprocal tariffs. We don't have a 90-day reprieve. We are currently under Section 232 tariffs, as would be many of TAFE's members who would be exporting to the US. Immediate impact for the sector. US is one of our big export markets from a component perspective. It's one of our largest as a direct component export market. There we don't see an immediate impact, in the sense of it generally takes around, let's say, 12 to 18 months to alter your supply chain. So if I'm a direct tier 1 component manufacturer or tier 2 supplying into tier 1s or OEMs in the US, it's not so simple as just suddenly resourcing to someone in the US. It takes time to build that capability. It takes time to do product testing. And so there's a little bit of time, I suppose, in that sense. And realistically speaking, the tariffs will hit the US consumers first before it hits us. Where the more immediate impact sits is on the vehicle side of things. So at least one of the OEMs has quite a large share of their exports to the US market. a lot, and ultimately it'll come down to, do the US consumers want to pay 25% more for that vehicle? If not, that's a loss of production or sales, ultimately production volumes, and that impacts the whole supply chain that is supporting that OEM. So that's where the most immediate impact sits. More into the medium term, you'll start to see the direct component export impact. And ultimately, the question becomes, can the United States develop its own internal capability to produce these components? If they can, then obviously that's a significant risk. If they can't, then the question is, well, does South Africa, with these 25% tariffs, we kind of somewhat on an even playing field with most other destinations that have similar tariffs? What can we make of that? And then really there's a lot of uncertainty there, and it waits to be seen. I think the other more immediate risk that maybe gets a little bit less attention is the risk that we currently face of dumping. We talk about, and this links into the AFCFTA, well, what are the opportunities in this? We need to obviously diversify where our exports are going. By and large, component exports are too concentrated by product, i.e. we export almost over half of our basket of catalytic converters, which are legacy technologies, and we export to the same small group-ish of companies in higher volumes. So we need to diversify, and that's where I think an AFCFTA plays a big role, and I think this has somewhat expedited the need to be creating an African ecosystem, so to speak. So far, AFCFTA is in play, but I don't think it's necessarily developed the auto sector in the way we initially anticipate. At the moment, the opportunities really more so sit in the aftermarket side of things, so supplying windscreens, tires, etc., into the aftermarket. But to develop an ecosystem, I think, and AAAM does a lot of good work around this, is we need to be strategic as a continent and work together as a continent to identify, I think, Philippa, you used the term earlier, pockets of excellence in the different countries, and work that together, rather than all of us trying to produce the exact same thing and sell it into the same market. So there needs to be a greater level of coordination there, but I think it is the big opportunity. But then back to the US implications, I think dumping, as I was saying, is the risk. We've already seen it on the tire side, on windscreen side, where we've had Chinese products dumped into the South African market. And as much as I'm currently saying AFCFTA looks like a good market and a good opportunity, every country around the world at the moment is looking at new export markets to alleviate the risk of a US, which has become a less reliable trading partner. And so naturally, someone is looking there saying, is South Africa a good opportunity for me to sell my products in? And we need to make sure that as a country, we don't end up in the process of us looking at new markets, losing our own market in that process.
Thanks, Beth. And I think, the notes about an ecosystem and, this sort of systems thinking is so important when looking at our manufacturing sector, because it's very nuanced. And how do we function across value chains, domestically, export-wise, within this very fluid environment? I am going to refer now to a really nice, a comment and a question I think is very well positioned in the Q&A, and I'm going to just talk to it and then go to you, Johan, and then Andre to sort of talk to the question as you deem fit, because it's got two components to it, and also perhaps just leave us with your parting thoughts as to if there's one key thing that the parties on this call should walk away with. What should it be in your view? So the comment suggests or indicates that and this is I'm very pleased to hear this, that there's a view by some credit rating agencies, investment community scholars, commentators, and reports in the media that a competitive manufacturing sector is a key determining factor on sustainable economic growth and development to SA Inc. I would certainly buy into that thinking. And then it goes on to say, on the other side of the coin, there's a major concern that the state has not adequately created an enabling environment for the manufacturing sector to thrive. What is your opinion on these recurrent views expressed about binding constraints in the manufacturing sector. So I'll leave it to you to decide which part you want to sort of maybe comment or talk to. And, you know, in addition to sort of closing off, I'll go to you first, Johan, and then we'll go to Andre, and then I'll ask Tafadzwa and Beth for their last closing comments as well. Johan, over to you.
Thanks, Philippa. I think, well, first off, let me just say I'm probably the last person that can comment on policy side of things. I must say that's definitely not an area of expertise. But if I just purely at a personal level look at, I would say I probably walk through 2 factories a week in South Africa manufacturing something, and some of them are, I want to call them formal sector, like the automotive side of things. But the real changes, I think, are almost at the level of, let's just say, consumer manufacturing. And that's where you realize the unbelievable importance of manufacturing, of creating a sustainable South Africa for that place. I'll steal some of Andre's thunder, but he mentioned earlier, we've got it. We've got the raw materials. We've got, and I think it's part of the big frustration is we have the raw materials, we have the workforce. We from a manufacturing point of view, we have the benefit of a weak currency. It's something that we perhaps don't even consider in the tariff scenario. But there's really unbelievable opportunity and creating stability from a social economic point of view, and really establishing long-term jobs for people that can actually then live in that pride. And I honestly think, as we see, agriculture used to be a big sector, but mechanization is taking over a lot in agriculture. Manufacturing has to be the next wave to that extent. And if you think about the turmoil in the world currently, is because that was recognized by the US, is to actually say, wait a minute, guys, the fact that we're losing manufacturing, or that we've lost manufacturing, is actually putting us in a very much a disadvantage in the world as an economy in the world. So yeah, I think from a positioning point of view, manufacturing has to be strong. It must be first and foremost. We've got all of the materials. So from a barrier to entry, South Africa is actually perfectly positioned. We've got the raw materials, we've got the workforce. You alluded to it earlier. Skills might be an issue, but that is something that can be addressed. And then actually to be a strong player in that space is definitely there. We actually, again, from a compliance perspective, we compete on the market already at this moment. The one thing I do just want to say from a policy perspective, and as I said, I must tread very softly because I'm very much a novice in that area, but I do think we have to understand what competitive at a global scale actually looks like. Now, quite often we talk about being competitive, and we need to improve efficiencies. We need to be competitive, but we need to understand, okay, what does that actually entail before we try and manage through policy? And that's more a warning towards introducing policy, because policy invariably always has a sting in the tail, kind of, So there's everything that gets there, and that's where I think we end up, I almost want to say, understanding or misunderstanding when we want to be competitive. More frequently, the current retailers have a big problem with the likes of Temu and Shein. Okay, but that gives you a very clear understanding of what global competitiveness actually look at, especially at a consumer level. So to step into that space, you need to understand the fight as a manufacturer. You need to understand the fight that's before you. But yeah, let me rather not go into the policy. I'll leave that for Andre. Looks like he understands policy, so I'll leave that to him.
Thanks, Johan. And as I suggested, please, Andre, respond to the comments as you see fit. There's no obligation to talk to the policy space as well. I'm going to leave that to you, Taffy, when we get to you. But Andre, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I think you were right there. Definitely not the expert on policy. I mean, maybe the only comment on that is, I think Johan did steal a little bit the wind out my sails there, and it's all fine. The big thing, and this has sort of been our experience on this, is I think we South Africans, we don't magically find a way out of a crisis. Like I think the solar rooftop or the wheeling example is, a massive way in which industry found a way to find a way out of a crisis, and led to 6 gigawatts of renewable energy being built on rooftops and batteries. So it's a remarkable way. And I mean, those are many parts of which, are manufactured overseas, but a lot of it is manufactured locally as well. I think my closing sort of comments on this is when it comes to, I mean, there's lots of challenges facing manufacturers. Has been sort of our experience. We've seen over the last year, we've seen over 350 different businesses in different parts of the country and various industries on this. And the one thing I think that we need to realize is, especially when it comes to some really basic things like the cost of electricity, like the nature of your electricity, you're not actually tied and blocked, and it is what it is. It's definitely not, there's only one solution. There is ways in which businesses can tick that, manufacturers can tick that risk, that constraint, that cost, that worry off their list. There's really are solutions available out there for businesses to take on, and I think there's just going to be more and more as we go along. So there is some silver linings and some green shoots in the market.
Thanks, Andre. Yes, we like silver linings and green shoots. Absolutely essential to keep going. Tafadzwa, can you give some parting thoughts?
Thanks, Philippa. I think maybe I'll touch on this policy area just a little bit and maybe make the broad comment that the role of policy is to facilitate, in a way you could almost say, channel behavior, facilitate the economy and make things easier, right? So, I mean, if one looks at the example that was mentioned by Andre, the 6 gigs that came on stream, part of the contributing reason for that was a policy decision around the tax incentive, right? We still think it could have been a lot more aggressive than what it was pegged at. But the point is, you navigate the economy in that direction, and that's the outcome. And so if that's the role of policy, right, to solve problems and make the operating environment much better, my parting shot would be this, Philippa, that in an environment, or rather, let me frame it differently, that exports are important, but the domestic economy has a very big role to play for domestic demand, especially for large technical capital intensive industries, which need constant demand. We think that the domestic economy has a very important role to play there. It has even a greater role to play in turbulent times like such as that we live in now, that the external environment is in a way closing on us. If you look at the US, if you look at carbon border adjustment mechanisms, to the extent that they create some hurdles, and many other areas as well. So in that instance, then the domestic economy has an important role to play in creating that consistent baseload demand. Then the export market is in a way a very lucrative top-up, but that's the role it should play, where through all the cycles, you have that baseload demand. And a big part of that is a policy choice to increase gross fixed capital formation, transferring it from consumption to fixed investment, allowing private sector to contribute in that play, and that way you raise demand and solve a lot of issues. So I'll park it on that, Philippa, and leave that as my parting shot. Thank you.
Thanks, Tafadzwa. Nicely put. Beth, I'd like to give you the last word. Over to you.
Kind of hard going after Taffy, and I almost sound like I'm using the exact same script as him. So I want to say ditto to everything he said around the domestic market. I think my parting shot, it probably goes all the way back to your opening remark, Philippa, about SEIFSA and metal or steel and engineering being the kind of backbone. And I think it's to say, from a policy, and I'm going to tackle the policy one because that is where I suppose my expertise does mostly sit. We have a lot of potential. We have a lot of capability. We have local steel, we have aluminium, we have copper in our neighboring countries particularly. We have a lot of the key input materials. Likewise, we have a very robust component manufacturing base. And I think it's these kind of areas, your kind of raw materials, component manufacturing, where you're going to see the job creation. At the end of the day, what we need desperately in South Africa and what will support growing your domestic market is obviously growth and employment. As we have more individuals able to spend money and invest money, that will support a level of growth. And so we need to be looking at, I guess, strategies that support an employment outcome. And I think to that point, NAACAM, particularly over the last few months, has been pretty vocal about it in media, but I think it becomes more and more important, and we've seen it somewhat in the AMSA crisis that kicked off the year for us, is that I think from a policy perspective, beyond the demand side of things, on the supply side, we need to be looking at much more kind of bottom-up competitiveness, increased support for raw materials, increased support for component manufacturing, and increased recognition of using those local materials for your final producers, be it in my industry, the OEM vehicle manufacturers, or any of your other kind of final producers. I think getting increased recognition of using your local materials there will boost competitiveness, ultimately boost employment, and that's when you start to see a level of economic growth filtering in. Always easier said than done. As Taffy said, I think in one of his earlier comments, it's not, we don't have a huge budget to work with here from a government side, but I do think some kind of realigned policies that focus on that bottom-up approach could be very well placed. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks, Beth. And I'd like to thank all of the panelists for this very engaging discussion. I think the very informed comments and the diverse discussion really suggests the importance of manufacturing in our economy that needs to be underpinned by competitiveness, and also the challenges and the nuances as well as the opportunities. So with that, Shannon, if I could hand back to you.
Thanks so much, Philippa. And with that, that brings us to the end of our webinar. I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to our facilitator, Philippa Rodseth, for enabling an engaging discussion. And thank you also to our panelists, Tafadzwa Chibanguza from SEIFSA, Johan from SYSPRO, Andre Nepgen from Discovery Green, and Beth Dealtry from NAACAM. Thank you also very much to our sponsors, Discovery Green, SYSPRO, the Steel and Engineering Industries Federation of Southern Africa, Columbus Stainless, and KEW Foundries for their support in making this webinar possible. And finally, thank you to the attendees for taking the time to join us for this discussion on local manufacturing. We hope you enjoyed the discussion and we appreciate your participation. Our next webinar takes place on Wednesday, 28 May at 2 p.m. and will focus on investing in the technologies and infrastructure needed to boost agricultural exports. The link to register for that webinar has been shared in the chat. The recording of today's webinar will be sent to you all in due course, and if you have any additional questions, please be in touch. You can reach us at shannon@creamermedia.co.za. Thank you so much for your time, and goodbye.